On a quiet Sunday morning in Faith Hollow, Tennessee, Pastor Elijah stood before his congregation. He'd been their shepherd for 17 years. But that day, something in his eyes had changed. He removed his clerical collar, whispered 5 words no one expected to hear, and walked into the forest behind the church. He was never seen again. What made a man of faith abandon everything he believed in? The answer was hidden in plain sight, until someone found the letter. Faith Hollow wasn't even a dot on most maps. Population, 3,012. One main street, traffic lights, and a church that sat on the edge of town, a quiet promise. For nearly 2 decades, that church had been home to Pastor Elijah Mercer, a man whose voice could calm a storm and whose faith seemed unshakable. He married couples in that sanctuary, baptized their children, buried their dead. In Faith Hollow, Elijah wasn't just a pastor, he was the heartbeat of the town. But on March 19, 2023, that heartbeat stopped. It was a Sunday like any other. Pews filled with familiar faces, hymns echoing off wooden beams, the smell of old Bibles and polished wood. Outside, the Tennessee spring air was cool and quiet. Inside, voices rose in unison, a sound that had shaped generations. Then Elijah stepped up to the pulpit. He gripped the edge, steadying himself. His sermon that morning had been about grace, about forgiveness, about the weight we carry when no one's watching. But as the final notes of the organ faded, something shifted. He looked out at the congregation, faces he'd known for years, Mrs. Patterson in the 3rd row, the Johnson family near the back, young Katie, who'd just been confirmed. And in that moment, his expression changed. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't fear, it was something deeper, something final. He descended from the pulpit slowly, each step deliberate. The silence in the room was thick. People exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, others held their breath. Then Elijah reached up, removed his clerical collar, and placed it gently on the communion table. He turned to face them one last time. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. God spoke to me. That was all he said. No explanation, no context, just those 5. Then he walked toward the back door, the one that led to the woods behind the church. He paused at the threshold, turned back, and embraced Deacon Harris, his oldest friend, without saying a word. And then he was gone. Into the trees, into the mist, into nothing. To understand what happened that Sunday, you have to understand who Elijah Mercer was. He wasn't born in Faith Hollow. He arrived in the summer of 2006, fresh out of seminary, with a worn suitcase and a calling he couldn't ignore. The church had been without a pastor for nearly a year. Attendance was down. The building needed repairs. But Elijah didn't see a dying congregation. He saw potential. Within months, he'd organized a food drive, started a youth group, reopened the church basement for community meals. People began to return, not because of miracles or theatrics, but because Elijah listened. He sat with the grieving, prayed with the lost, never judged, never turned anyone away. By 2010, Faith Hollow Community Church was. Elijah had become more than a pastor. He was a counselor, a mediator, a friend. But there was one tragedy he couldn't overcome. In 2015, his wife, Anne, died suddenly from an aneurysm. She was only 41. The town mourned with him. They brought casseroles, sat with him in silence, offered what comfort they could. But Elijah never fully recovered. Those who knew him best, like Deacon Harris and Sarah, the church secretary, said he changed after Anne's death. He smiled less, prayed more, spent long hours alone in his office, reading scripture late into the night. Still, he never wavered in his duties, never missed a sermon, never stopped caring for him. But something had shifted inside him, a quiet burden no one could name. And in the weeks before that final Sunday, people noticed small things. Elijah canceling meetings, skipping meals, walking the perimeter of the forest behind the church at dawn, staring into the trees like he was looking for something or someone. Sarah asked him once if he was okay. He smiled, that same tired smile, and said, "I'm exactly where I need to be." 3 days later, he was gone. The first hour after Elijah walked into the forest, people thought he'd come back. Maybe he needed air. Maybe he was praying. But when an hour became two, concern turned to alarm. Deacon Harris was the first to act. He and 3 others entered the woods, calling Elijah's name. The forest behind Faith Hollow Community Church wasn't large, maybe 80 acres, but it was dense. Old-growth oaks and pines, thick underbrush, no clear trails. They searched until sunset. Nothing, no footprints, no torn fabric, no sign he'd been there at all. By Monday morning, the sheriff's department was involved. Search and rescue teams arrived with dogs. Volunteers from neighboring towns showed up with flashlights and radios. They combed every inch of the. They checked abandoned cabins, old hunting stands, creek beds. It was as if Elijah had simply vanished. The town spiraled. Some believed he'd had a breakdown. Others whispered about suicide. A few thought he'd planned it, that he'd left Faith Hollow for good, and the forest was. But most people couldn't accept any of it. This was Elijah, the man who'd never missed a Sunday, who'd baptized their children, who'd held their hands at funerals. How could he just leave? The church became a gathering place for grief and confusion. People filled the pews, not for worship, but for answers. Sarah tried to keep things running. She organized prayer vigils, posted missing person flyers. But with each passing day, hope faded, and something else crept in, doubt. Not just about Elijah, but about everything. If a man of God could disappear without a word, what did that mean for the rest of them? Some stopped coming to church altogether. Others came more desperate for reassurance. The community that Elijah had built began to fracture. And then, 2 weeks after he vanished, something strange happened. A hiker found Elijah's clerical collar, not in the forest, but nailed to a tree, on the far edge of the woods, facing away from town. Finding the collar changed everything. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. Elijah had placed it there. Or someone had. The sheriff reopened the investigation. But this time, they weren't just searching the forest. They were searching Elijah's life. Detectives went through his office, his home, his car. What they found didn't bring comfort. It brought more questions. Elijah's personal journals, dozens of them dating back years, were filled with passages, not sermons, not reflections, but something darker, confessions, fears, references to the burden and the truth I cannot speak. In one entry, dated 3 months before he vanished, he wrote, "If they knew what I've done, they would never forgive me. But God sees, God knows, and He has given me a way out." What had he done? Detectives interviewed everyone close to him, Sarah, Deacon Harris, members of the congregation, but no one knew of any scandal, no financial misconduct, no inappropriate relationships, no crimes, just a man who, after his wife died, became quieter. One journal entry, written 2 weeks before he disappeared, stood out. It simply read, "The forest is not what they think it is. It's not an ending, it's a door." That line haunted investigators. What did he mean? A door to what? Theories multiplied. Some thought Elijah had been planning this for months, that the sermon, the collar, the walk into the woods, it was all staged. A final act of theater before starting a new life somewhere far away. Others believed he'd suffered a psychotic break. That grief over Anne had finally broken him, and the voice of God was really the voice of his own unraveling mind. But a third theory emerged, quieter, darker. What if Elijah had discovered something about the church, about the town, about himself, something so unbearable that disappearing was the only option? And then, 6 weeks after his disappearance, Sarah found it, hidden inside Elijah's personal Bible, an envelope, unsealed. Inside was a letter, written in his hand, addressed to no one. "I am not who you think I am." That's how the letter began. Sarah read it 3 times before she could process what it meant. Elijah's handwriting, his words, but a voice she didn't recognize. The letter was long, detailed, and deeply personal. In it, Elijah confessed to something that had haunted him for decades. Before he became a pastor, before Faith Hollow, before Anne. He had been someone else. His real name wasn't Elijah Mercer. It was David Kane. And 30 years earlier, in a different state, he'd been involved in an accident, a car crash late at night. He'd been driving. There was a passenger, a young woman. She didn't survive. The investigation ruled it an accident. No charges were filed, but David, knew the truth. He'd been drinking, not heavily, but enough. He'd never told anyone. He carried it, buried it. And when he found faith, he thought he'd found forgiveness. He wasn't the same as I thought if I gave my life if I served others, if I loved this community with everything I had, could balance the scales. Maybe I could become someone worthy of the mercy I'd been given. But I was wrong. You can't outrun guilt. You can't bury shame. It waits. And God spoke to me that night, not in words, but in a feeling. And I knew it was time to face what I'd done. Not in front of you, not in a courtroom, but in the only place I've ever felt truly alone, the forest. Sarah didn't know what to do with the letter. If she shared it, Elijah's legacy would be destroyed. The man who'd been a pillar of the community would become a lie, but if she kept it hidden, she'd be complicit in that lie. She showed the letter to Deacon Harris. He read it in silence. When he finished, he looked at her and said, "This doesn't change what he did for us, but it explains why he left." They decided together to share it, not with the police, not with the media, but with the congregation. On a Sunday morning, 2 months after Elijah disappeared, Sarah stood where he'd stood, and she read the letter aloud. Some people wept, others walked out. A few sat in stunned silence, but most stayed. And in the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The church didn't empty, it filled. People came to talk, to confess their own burdens, to admit their own guilt. Elijah's disappearance had cracked something open, a space for honesty, for vulnerability, for the kind of grace he'd always preached, but never fully believed he deserved. The last line of Elijah was the hardest to read. Sarah's voice cracked. She spoke it aloud. "If I am wrong, he forgive me. If I am right, you will understand in time." No one knew exactly what he meant. Was he asking us? Was he predicting something? Or was he simply saying goodbye in the only way he could? The search for Elijah never officially ended. His case remains open. But after the letter was read, the urgency faded. People stopped looking for him in the forest and started looking for him in themselves. The truth is, Elijah Mercer was never going to be found, not because he was hiding, but because he'd already decided the forest wasn't his, it was his a place where he could finally be alone with his guilt, where he didn't have to pretend to be the man everyone needed him to be. In the months that followed, Faith Hollow changed. The church became a place where people came not with answers, but with questions, not with certainty, but with doubt. And somehow that made it strong. Sarah took over as interim pastor. She didn't try to replace Elijah. She simply carried forward what he'd started, a community built on honesty, even when it hurt. Deacon Harris planted a tree at the edge of the forest. Not a memorial, just a marker. A quiet acknowledgement that some people leave this world not in death, but in a kind of chosen silence. And every now and then, someone from town would walk to that tree, stand there for a moment, and wonder, not where Elijah went, but why he had to go at all. Maybe the answer is simpler than we think. Maybe he didn't walk into the forest to escape. Maybe he walked into it to finally stop running, to face the only person he'd never been able to forgive, himself. The Bible Elijah left behind is still in the church, open to the same passage he'd marked, Psalm 51, verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Some believe he is still out there, living under a new name, starting over. Others believe he never left the forest at all, that he found what he was looking for, peace, silence, an ending on his own terms. But the truth is, Elijah Mercer is wherever people carry him, in the sermons they remember, in the kindness he taught, in the reminder that even men of faith are still just men, broken, flawed, searching. And maybe that's the real lesson, not that Elijah disappeared, but that he was brave enough to admit he was never the person everyone thought he was. And in doing so, he gave others permission to do the same. Elijah's story doesn't have a neat ending. That's the point. Life rarely does. But his choice to face his truth, even in silence, reminds us that we all carry burdens. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we're not who people think we are. If this story moved you, if it made you think, leave a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Follow this channel for more real stories about faith, loss, and the choices that do. And remember, you're not alone in what you. Thank you for watching.